they are actively complicit in a genocidal war.
The Muslim community in particular doesn't really count.
The idea of allowing the Labour leadership to behave like that and not suffer a cost.
So have they just made a cynical calculation?
They have contempt towards Muslim voters. A really good example is Liam Mohammed standing in Ilford North. He was obviously very dynamic and charismatic.
You would rather the Labour Party did not secure a massive victory in the next general election.
They are deeply authoritarian, power-crazed people, in my view, and I don't trust them with power.
Are we not just stacking up problems for ourselves if we don't find a way to engage with Labour?
If politicians think you will vote for them no matter what, then they will just ignore you and they will treat you as they wish.
Yeah.
That's what they think. They just think, what a bunch of suckers.
I find George Galloway quite a problematic actor. I don't know. Okay, so that's
problematic.
The Labour Party is en route to form the next government of the United Kingdom, with most analysts describing its victory to be a landslide majority. The Conservatives have resided over a failed government, with Brexit, the economic crisis and poor public services now associated with Rishi Sunak's lacklustre government. Labour's leader Keir Starmer is comfortably ahead in the polls, and it is often stated quite openly now that the Tories will be out of government for a generation. Yet on Gaza, the Labour Party's policy has been horrendous. It has given a green light to Israel from the very start of this genocidal campaign, with its frontbenchers including David Lammy, Wes Streeting, Emily Thornberry and Lisa Nandy, making it very clear that they supported a siege of Gaza or the absolute right of Israel to self-defense. Labour continued this position despite the carnage and despite the interim judgment by the ICJ that clearly stated Israel was committing a plausible genocide. I have visited many Muslim communities in towns and cities across the UK, and it is clear to me that the anger is palpable. There is a consensus forming that we can no longer vote for a party that has given a green light to killing on an industrial scale. To help us make a case against Labour, I have the pleasure today to speak to probably someone who is the most qualified to discuss the party, journalist and commentator Owen Jones. Owen has been a principled campaigner for Gaza and recently made an unprecedented move to leave Labour. He now calls for an alliance of independents and progressives in the next general election. Owen Jones is a Guardian columnist and the author of a number of books, including The Establishment and How They Get Away with It. Owen, it's wonderful to have you with us.
It's a pleasure. Big honour. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much. Now, Owen, let's start from the top. You left the party after many years, over 20 years of campaigning for the party. And it seems to me that Gaza was pretty instrumental in the reason why you came to that decision. So explain to us, to our viewers, why you left the Labour Party.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm a geriatric millennial, and I look a bit like Macaulay Culkin in Home Alone, but I'm 39, so I first joined the Labour Party, actually. I was gifted a Labour Party membership by my mum on my 15th birthday, which just shows how sad I am, I suppose. You know, my great-granddad was a Labour councillor, my grandmother was a Labour councillor. My parents met in the Labour Party in 1969. So the Labour Party for me is obviously, to be honest, just a big part of my identity, big part of my sense of self. I used to work for Labour MPs, John McDonnell, who became Jamie Corbyn's shadow chancellor long before that. I've campaigned under and you know, voted for the Labour Party under every single leader. The reason, before Gaza, there is a pragmatic reason as well, which is that this is the most authoritarian leadership of the Labour Party in its history. Yeah. That's a point made by John Cruddas, a Labour MP in Dagenham, who was from the centre of the party, I would say, used to be an advisor to Tony Blair. And that's a critical point, because those in charge have made a calculation that the mistake made in the 90s was to believe that the left was dead and therefore left-wing MPs could be ignored. And this time around, their view is they need to just be crushed. And that means shutting down all democracy in the Labour Party, but also making Labour a hostile environment for anyone to the left of Peter Mandelson. Okay. So that means my own pragmatic view is you need external pressure, because the authoritarianism is way beyond anything Tony Blair had. He didn't go around just purging MPs. Yeah. You know, take Kate Osmore, one of the only black female Labour MPs, kicked out the Labour Party, suspended from the Labour whip, when she described Gaza as a genocide on the very day the International Court of Justice, the world's highest court, described it as a plausible genocide and put Israel on trial for genocide. Yeah. So that just shows the kind of what we're dealing with pragmatically. So my view is you need external pressure. Whatever people think about, could the Labour Party shift in a different direction in the future? Without external pressure, there's no chance of that happening. And we can see with the Conservatives how UKIP and the Brexit Party played a pivotal role in reshaping the Conservatives. But in terms of, there was domestic policy too, which is everything from the fiscal rule, Labour support, which bakes in austerity, investment in public services and so on, which will hammer working class people. And I would know Muslim communities where poverty is significantly higher have been disproportionately hit by austerity. Living standards, often public sector workers and jobs as well. And those communities which have been really hit, whether it be in East London, Yorkshire, lots of places with large and vibrant Muslim communities which have been badly hit by the worst squeeze in living standards for workers in history. Labour's fiscal rule means that will continue. It also means that they support, for example, the two-child benefit cap, which drives 250,000 kids into poverty and 850,000 kids further into poverty. Even New Labour didn't support poverty measures, pro-poverty measures. They had the minimum wage. I didn't think they went far enough, but they lifted people out of poverty. The point about Gaza, though, is the Labour leadership has become actively complicit in a genocidal war.
Complicit.
Actively complicit. Now, the reason I say that is some people, the response is, why are you having a Labour thought of government? Now, I mean, there's a few things there. When Keir Starmer said he supported the right of Israel to cut off water and energy to a civilian population, which is a straightforward war crime, for a start violates Article 33 of the Geneva Convention. I know that. I'm not a human rights lawyer. Keir Starmer is. He knows exactly. I mean, he's taken Serbia to court on behalf of Croatia in the International Court of Justice, alleging genocide. He knows what international law says. He sent repeatedly shadow cabinet ministers like Emily Thornberry, my own MP, to go on TV and defend his position. And I watched her on the 10th of October or 11th of October on Newsnight, where she repeatedly refused to condemn cutting off food, water, energy, and all the essentials of life as illegal, and indeed responded Israel has an absolute right to defend itself. Well, we can see that absolute right now being played out, which is people starving to death and people, as well as, you know, a level of destruction of infrastructure which is so severe that Gaza now looks a different colour and texture from space. But starvation, people dying because the medical system's been dismantled. And I texted Emily Thornberry when she went on. I've always had a very good relationship with Emily Thornberry, and I said, there's absolutely no chance that I will be able to vote for you. Now, my view is why, in terms of when we talk about complicity, because then Keir Starmer came out and gaslit people by saying that he never believed Israel had the right to cut off energy and water, even though we could hear what he said with our own ears, is from the very beginning, public opinion did not support Israel's onslaught. It's a really important point. YouGov, in October, about 12, 13 days after this began, before the ground invasion of Gaza, found well over 50% of the population said they definitely supported an immediate ceasefire. Another 15% or so said they probably supported an immediate ceasefire. And just 3% said they definitely opposed an immediate ceasefire. That's the same number of people who think the earth is flat. And yet that was the opinion, the consensus in the British media and the British political elite. And what the Labour opposition did is protect the Conservative government from any public pressure. And that allowed the Conservative government to not end our arms sales to Israel, because there's no pressure for them to do so, no political cost for their position, to continue using its diplomatic and public support of Israel as a key Western ally. And if the government had taken a different position because it had been forced to, given the government's very weak, by a Labour opposition which was on the side of public opinion, then the British government could have been forced into a very different position, and that would have put huge pressure on other Western governments, not least the United States. I mean, in the United States, if Britain had taken a different position, that would have hugely strengthened Democrats and others who would call for Biden to shift position. Look what Britain's doing, our special ally. So that, for me, is unforgivable, because they are actively complicit in a genocidal war by coming out and supporting, from the very beginning, a war crime. You know, what Israeli leaders would have seen when they're watching these Labour politicians go on TV and make that kind of arguments is they would have felt delighted, because what that does is legitimise some of the worst crimes being committed in the 21st century. And what I would say is, you know what? I didn't have any special powers of prediction. I'm not a prophet. I said from the beginning what I thought was going to happen. On the 9th of October, when Yoav Gallant, the defence minister, said that he was going to cut off all the essentials of life on the basis they were fighting human animals, I said on the 9th of October that was genocidal rhetoric, because it is. And all you needed to do is not have a crystal ball.
Yeah.
You didn't need to have some special, you didn't have to have a PhD in the matter. You just needed to listen to what Israeli leaders and officials said they were going to do. And from the very beginning, they said very loudly, their officials, their leaders, that they were going to wipe Gaza out, that they were going to institute collective punishment, that they held the Palestinian people in Gaza collectively guilty, and that they were going to institute what could only be described as an attempt to ethnically cleanse the Palestinian population. They could not have screamed their intent more loudly. And I interviewed the brilliant Israeli-American associate professor of genocide and Holocaust studies, Raz Sigal, and he said it's extremely rare for intent to be so loudly broadcast. Normally, states don't do that when they commit terrible crimes. Yeah. What they do is they cover up, they lie, they claim even humanitarian pretenses. You know, you have to end up like, you know, there's secret documents you have to find and all the rest of it.
Rwanda or Yugoslavia.
Exactly. You don't get, you know, Slobodan Milosevic was not going around saying, let's kill all these people. That's not what happened. Yeah. And in Bosnia, the Bosnian Serb armies didn't do that either. This was, you know, well, I mean, there were exceptions, but generally speaking, on the level of what the Israeli state has done, I would know actually a long-standing alliance between many Israeli leaders and the Bosnian Serb leadership, and I think there are actually some quite striking parallels there, by the way. But it was very clear what was going to happen from the very beginning, and those who failed to call it out, let alone who legitimised it, it was criminal. And I just, you know, the idea of allowing the Labour leadership to behave like that and not suffer a cost, I don't think is acceptable, because that shows what they will be like in government.
On the 15th of November, there was the first SNP ceasefire vote, and the Labour Party whipped its members against that. And the news was from the whips that even if you argue that public opinion was on the side of a ceasefire, that they made an electoral calculation that it's not really going to affect the ultimate outcome of the next general election. And I think I heard from a number of sources that they even said to some members who were teetering between voting for or against the ceasefire motion, that the Muslim community in particular doesn't really count, because they're never going to be able to, challenge the electoral calculus that they've made. The electoral arithmetic, in other words, is on their side. At the beginning, I think you've mentioned it in your article, that, you know, the Labour Party is on for a very huge majority.
Yeah.
So have they just made a cynical calculation that it's not going to impact them in the next general election, despite what opinion polls say now about a ceasefire?
Well, there's absolutely no question Labour are going to win a landslide victory, because the Tories have destroyed themselves.
Yeah.
Partygate alone is enough to finish off a government. You know, partying, violating the rules of the pandemic, the biggest public health emergency in 100 years, whilst people couldn't hold the hands of their dying relatives, and they were, you know, dancing around drunk and doing karaoke and getting so drunk they were vomiting down the walls. You know, I mean, this is what we're talking about in that, and they lied through their teeth.
Yeah.
The worst squeeze in living standards in recorded history, that's sufficient. The NHS falling to pieces, that's sufficient. The numerous scandals and resignations that have been forced. To be honest, I've not even mentioned the big one, which is Liz Truss. I mean, after that, you know, an economic experiment which most people on its own terms don't support, things like cutting tax on the rich, but that crashed the economy and sent people's mortgages and rents soaring. So that's why they're finished. That's why they're toast. It's not because of anything Labour have done. It's because people are desperate to get the Conservatives out. I understand that completely. The point, firstly I would make is what you're referring to there is the Labour leadership just has no sense of what is right and wrong. They're not looking at the morality of a genocidal war. They're looking at very crude electoral calculations. Now, if we were talking about, Russia, I mean, imagine Keir Starmer at the beginning had said, imagine any politician had said, I think Russia's got the right to cut off water and energy to Ukrainian civilians. They would be driven out of public life. That would be the end of them. Yeah. People wouldn't go, well, they're not in power, so why do you care so much? Yeah. People would go, well, that's just absolutely unacceptable. Now, they don't understand the difference between right and wrong. And I can say that because, some might go, well, that's a morally outrageous, you can't just You can disagree with Owen, but don't impugn their morality.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sorry, if you support cutting off water, if you use your platform to do that, then you don't understand, you don't have a proper, you lack a moral compass. I don't think there's any way around that. Never in my life have I just realised that I'm in a different moral universe from my opponents. Because people, the argument there is, oh, you think you're also morally superior? Yes, actually, yeah. Yeah, I do. I think if you support cutting off water and energy and the light and the essential light to civilians, to civilian population, you are morally inferior to me. I think I don't have any people. I don't care if that sounds arrogant. If you're complicit in genocide and war crimes, you are morally inferior. Yes, I'm very prepared to say that. So that's what that shows. They look at everything through crude electoral calculation. The second point is they obviously have contempt towards Muslim voters. Yeah. And I don't know how much more loudly they are supposed to express this until that is understood.
Yeah.
In the Batley and Spen by-election, they briefed beforehand, Labour officials briefed beforehand suggesting that Muslim disillusionment with the Labour Party was to do with anti-Semitism. And then Angela Rayner, the deputy leader, promised an investigation into that. That never happened. After Labour narrowly won that by-election, a Labour source briefed that bragging that they had won over Tory voters, they built a new electoral coalition, they said, where they had won over Tory voters and lost the Conservative Muslim vote, they said, over gay rights and anti-Semitism. Now, I went to Batley and Spen, and I spoke to people in every political party, including people who, Labour canvassers who passionately support Keir Starmer. None of those issues came up on the doorstep. It was just a lie. No one was talking about gay rights and no one was talking about anti-Semitism on the doorstep as reasons for not voting for the Labour Party. It's just a lie. And what they were doing is whipping up bigotry about Muslim voters and showing that they have contempt towards Muslim voters. Now, it is true, given the scale of the majority they're going to win and the desperation, including amongst many British Muslim voters, for the Tories to be ejected, and, the fact there isn't a difference on the issue of Gaza between Labour and the Conservatives, that as things stand, that whatever they do, they're not gonna do anything other than win a landslide majority. Yeah. The point is the rot sets in because Keir Starmer is the most unpopular leader of the opposition set to win a general election. Peter Kellner, founder of YouGov, very close to the New Labour project, wrote a very interesting piece looking at and analysing how unpopular Keir Starmer was, and pointing out that something's going to have to give when he becomes prime minister by default, because you can't have for a long time both leaderships of the main parties being so unpopular without other parties then beginning to emerge and challenge them. And the point I'd make is they're hubristic. Hubris, anyone who's familiar with Greek tragedy, you're overwhelmed by total self-confidence and triumphalism, and then you meet nemesis, and what they're doing is going through what Tony Blair went through when he was prime minister after many years. Because after he'd been prime minister for many years, you got sections of Labour's core vote moving against him. But that's already happening for Keir Starmer, but he's in opposition. He's not prime minister. And the point I would make is he'll become prime minister in the worst possible circumstances, a crisis-ridden country in which it's basically falling apart in lots of literal ways. And he doesn't have policies to deal with those questions because he's not committed to increase taxes on the well-off in order to invest in public services. He's going to be extremely unpopular. And I think it is hubris to think that they can just, given Muslim voters are a very key part of Labour's coalition, basically bed in active contempt already when they're going to hit problems very, very quickly. And then a lot of other voters are also going to peel away. And then they're going to find themselves trying to cling on to Muslim voters and others for dear life. Go, oh, no, we didn't mean it. We didn't mean it. Well, that's what they'll do, by the way. Yes. It's very clear they'll do that. But as things stand, they think, we can get away with anything right now because we'll win a landslide victory. And Muslim voters don't have anywhere to go, and they'll, we can show as much contempt for them and they'll still vote for us. That's what they think.
So your basic argument is that you would rather the Labour Party did not secure a massive victory in the next general election, even though they're going to win it, and it's most likely that it's going to be a sizable majority. But if we can make that majority as slim, as limited as possible, that will be a good thing. So surely the Labour Party would know this. I mean, I've done some cursory, maybe some detailed number crunching, and it seems to me that in over 100 seats, Muslims hold a balance of power. You know, if the total Muslim vote voted in a direction against Labour, then Labour could not secure that seat, even with a swing, you know, 20% swing to Labour. In many of those seats, Labour wouldn't win it. Now, notwithstanding the fact that whether that's going to happen, you know, I suspect the Muslim community is far more fractious than that. But surely they would have known that, and they should at this stage regard the Muslim vote to be far more precious than what seemingly they are. I mean, how do you...
I think just because of the sheer scale of the Conservative collapse and how
Right.
much of the Conservative vote is hemorrhaged to reform,
Yeah.
and the fact that we're quite close to an election, relatively speaking now, and there's no sign of a swing back to the government, and indeed, basically, Tory voters have doggedly stuck to reform and don't seem to offer any evidence that they're going to go back to the Conservatives. I just think their view is it's just not a realistic menace.
Yeah.
I mean, the point I make is what the Labour will do now, and I can see them doing it, is they're going to try and spook people into thinking the Conservatives have a chance of winning.
Yes.
And there is more chance of, you know, my cat becoming supreme emperor of the universe than the Conservatives winning. The reason that Labour are saying that is because they want the biggest possible majority, because they want unchecked power.
Yeah.
And we can see what they'll do with that unchecked power. We can see that by the way they kick out MPs who speak out in the case of, you know, calling Gaza a genocide, which it is. Or, for example, you know, Andy McDonald, they suspended the whip and only eventually let him back in when he called for Israeli and Palestinian people to live in peace and harmony between the river and the sea. Whereas you can support war crimes and you can remain a Labour MP. So we also saw what they did in terms of the Speaker when the SNP motion recently rightly holding Israel to account for collective punishment. And they went round, this just shows how cocky they are. They went around briefing journalists that they had told the Speaker that unless they did in that SNP motion, then when Labour won a majority, they would throw him out of the chair and end his political career.
Wow.
Now, that is as symptomatic of a profoundly authoritarian mentality. And you know what? I mentioned I worked for Labour MPs. I worked for John McDonnell, and the first week I worked for him was November 2005. And it was when Labour were trying to drive through 90 days detention. And we were, you know, thrown in the deep end, having to ring MPs and try and convince them to defy the whip and vote against. And actually, it was funny because that was the first week Labour had suffered a successful rebellion and 90 days detention was overturned, thankfully. But that was just another example of the attacks on civil liberties, which a lot of them are infested with Islamophobic undertones, a sense of, you know, clamping down on civil liberties, partly because of a kind of demonization, using Muslims as a bogeyman. And we saw that with the attack on the way that they cooperated with the speaker. Sorry, they helped pressure the speaker into doing in the SNP motion, because then a nonsense claim in justification was spread, which was the reason that the speaker had done that was because of threats to MPs from protesters. Yes. And then clearly the argument had to be made, which protesters are we talking about? And then the argument was made that it was Muslim protesters. And then you had to reconcile the fact that there are more arrests at Glastonbury than these large protests. The number of arrests are very small, which is why then you got conspiracy theories peddled by the likes of Suella Braverman that this was because Islamists are in charge of Britain, and the Metropolitan Police are somehow terrified of some weird Islamist cabal. That was set off by the Labour Party because they had to justify doing in that motion. So the point I'm making is they want a big motion, they want a big majority. They're going to spook people into voting for them just to get that majority, and then they're going to, in my view, carry on where New Labour left off in terms of clamping down on civil liberties. But they'll be worse because they're more authoritarian. We can see that in terms of the Labour Party. It'll have profound Islamophobic undertones. Now, you know, I think you're right. Whatever happens, I think they're going to win a massive majority. My own view is right now it's about laying the foundations, because I think when they're in power, they're going to be profoundly unpopular because they don't have answers to the issues affecting millions of people in terms of their daily lives, in terms of the social ruin left by the Conservatives, as well as their position on foreign policy. I honestly think they would end up going to war on the basis they thought it went down well in a focus group. That's the sort of people we're dealing with. And also the people dominant in the Labour Party are the sorts of people who even knowing what they know now, would invade Iraq all over again. Luke Akehurst is on the National Executive Committee. He's a prominent figure in Labour First, which is a faction of the Labour right, which is dominant now in the Labour Party. They're the ones who are basically calling the shots in lots of ways. Now, Luke Akehurst is the head of a pro-Israel lobbying group called We Believe in Israel. I mean, he's literally there arguing on behalf of the interests of a foreign state engaging in a genocidal war. And, imagine we had someone who is, I don't know, another chronically human rights abusing. What, are we going to have We Believe in North Korea or Saudi Arabia for that matter? Yes. Other states which are guilty of terrible human rights violations. And yet he's, those are the sorts of people who clearly are very powerful within the Labour Party, and that they want that power. My own view is about laying the foundations, because they'll come to power, they'll be very unpopular, and we've laid the foundations. And I think people, at the moment, people just think we want the Tories out. Basically they're rallying around the opposition. It's a rally around the opposition effect. Keir Starmer's the only possible alternative, therefore we can't rock the boat. But when they come to power, they're going to listen to us and they're going to think, well, actually, they were right about what they said. Because I think a lot of people at the moment don't realise how bad they'll be. They think they'll be better. Yeah. They think they'll rip off some Superman cape, and they're only saying this for electoral reasons because they don't want to scare the Daily Mail and the Sun. That isn't true. They believe what they're saying. Yeah. That's what they'll be like in power. And I think now what we have to do is make the case. They're going to win the landslide. Then those people will laugh at us and go, ha ha, see, look, you were the critics who were proven wrong. They've won this massive majority. Let's revisit that after a year or two. And I think people will be listening to us and think, well, actually, they were right all along, which I think we are.
I mean, that's interesting. So your argument effectively is that they're going to win. There's no way the Conservative Party will form the next government.
Zero.
It's just not going to happen. So your detractors who argue that you're falling into some sort of Tory trap are just scaremongering, right?
Yeah, because they just want Labour to win a massive majority so they can literally do what they want.
Yeah.
These are power mad people. They really are. I mean, they have to be power mad because they don't. What do they want to use power for? Yeah. What's their big mission? Is it to take on poverty? Well, no, because they support the two-child benefit cap, which, if you wanted to find the cheapest possible way to, in one stroke, lift kids out of poverty, that's the one policy you'd suddenly get rid of.
Yeah.
They don't support rebuilding public services trashed by the Tories because their fiscal rule and opposition to raising taxes on well-off Britons means that they can't. Is it human rights abroad? Clearly not. What do they want power for? Yeah. So they just want power because that's an end in itself. And I know a lot of these people. I've been around the Labour Party for a very long time, and they are deeply authoritarian, power-crazed people, in my view, and I don't trust them with power. I've never felt scared of a Labour Party taking power on the basis of what I think they would do to what risk they pose to democracy. I think they would introduce attacks on civil liberties out of spite. Really? They denounced the Conservative Party for not cracking down enough on climate change protesters. And I just think, do you really think, given how they despise anyone associated with the left, or indeed those who have a different position on foreign policy, or oppose these genocidal wars, what do you think they're going to do? They're the ones who whipped up this scaremongering about MPs being menaced by protesters above all. It was Labour who did that more than the Conservatives.
Yes.
I think they'll do clampdowns on those sorts of rights. Is this like, I'm not saying MP safety isn't important. Of course it is.
Yes.
But I would know with some distaste the way that the far-right terrorist murder of Joe Cox was used, for example, in the context of the debate on Gaza. Do you remember any parliamentary discussions or debates about immigration and how inflammatory and radicalising that can be for far-right extremists? Do you remember Joe Cox being... where it's actually relevant and appropriate,
yes,
that's not raised.
Yes.
When we're having about Rwanda and inflammatory attacks on migrants and refugees, you don't suddenly hear, well, look, we need to be careful about the rhetoric because MPs, that doesn't happen. But we did have that when we're talking about protesters, for whom the vast majority are peaceful and more peaceful than the average football match.
Let's go back to Gaza policy and Labour. There is an argument, and I hear this within some elements of the Muslim community who still hold on to some hope when it comes to the Labour Party, that tonally there's been a shift in the Labour Party. And yes, the beginning stages was horrid and, Keir Starmer got it all wrong. But since then, I mean, especially over the last couple of months, there is a shift in terms of Labour policy towards a ceasefire, although it's still a bit unclear, it seems to me, or Labour policy towards arming Israel. They're holding the government more to account on arming Israel, and they've asked for the legal advice that have been offered to the government on Israel. So on a number of in a number of areas on Gaza, there is a shift, the argument goes, and maybe Labour's position has become far more nuanced and maybe far more favourable towards a pro-Palestinian position. I mean, how would you respond to that?
It's nonsense. They track the State Department. They just listen to how much the US State Department has shifted, and then they decide whether or not it's safe enough to shift without going further than US policy. And to be honest, they've basically tracked a lot of where the Conservatives are at. David Cameron has tonally shifted. David Cameron has, I mean, Elon Levy, the obnoxious Israeli spokesperson, one of many, lost his job essentially because he claimed that unlimited aid was allowed into Gaza. And then David Cameron released a letter to Alicia Kearns. I would know, actually, a Conservative chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee who's done infinitely more than Keir Starmer has.
He's been very good, right?
Far better than the Labour leadership. It's a low bar, though. That's the problem. Now, David Cameron then issued, in that statement, he went through all of the ways that Israel was obstructing, getting aid into Gaza. And that's why Elon Levy lost. Now, David Cameron, I still think, is complicit in a genocidal war. I'm not trying to give him, a cookie here. I'm saying the bar is on the floor. And what Labour has done is less than the bare minimum, because the legal advice we know from Alicia Kearns doing a leaked recording of Alicia Kearns to Conservative activists, in which she said that the legal advice the government had received was that Israel had violated international humanitarian law and that they were refusing to release that intelligence. And you can tell, if you look back to January when David Cameron was interrogated by the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, and he was repeatedly asked about the legal advice, and, the guy, give him credit, is extremely good at being very, very slippery. And you could see what he was doing in that situation where he was being asked. He was like, I can't remember every piece of paper put in front of me. I mean, of course, he's going to remember legal advice on whether or not Israel is violating international humanitarian law. And even having to have this discussion is deranged. Obviously, Israel has violated international humanitarian law over and over and over and over again. It has, it has basically gone through the Geneva Convention and thought, how can we do the exact opposite of what is in the Geneva Convention? The fact we even have to have this discussion. So what Labour is doing, what Labour should do is go, it's clear the legal advice is that international humanitarian law has been broken. We've taken our own legal advice because obviously there are a vast abundance of lawyers who believe that Israel has systematically violated international humanitarian law. And they should say, as a consequence, as a bare minimum, that Britain should end arms sales, which is what they're required to do, as well as end intelligence sharing. And they should also impose sanctions on Israel. And the point is, what Labour will do, Netanyahu knows that it doesn't, Western journalists sometimes have to vent for the interests of public opinion. They know that, and they don't care. What they care about, and what Israel will listen to, is action, which is ending arms sales, sanctions, and diplomatic pressure. That's what they listen to. And Labour is not committing to that. They're basically, they have refused once to say that Israel's committed war crimes. Now, when Keir Starmer was asked about that, he said, oh, well, it's not for us, to basically issue a running commentary and, that's sort of lawyers to decide. Not what he said on Russia. When he was asked about Putin committing war crimes in Ukraine, which we can all agree Putin very clearly has committed war crimes, as he committed in Chechnya, though at the time Labour called Vladimir Putin a reformer, when he was wiping Chechnya off the face of the earth and slaughtering huge numbers of Muslim civilians. But in this particular case, he was asked, about Putin, and he was extremely clear. He's a war criminal. He's committed war crimes. Israel has committed worse war crimes. I'm not letting Russia off the hook. They've committed grave war crimes in Ukraine, but the war crimes in Gaza are much, much, much worse in terms of proportion and absolute numbers. Now, and I think that's why, what Labour is saying is a nonsense. They are just saying, basically, they think they can trick voters into thinking, well, look, we've listened, we've said, look how we're sounding off. We've shifted our position, we've listened to you, without doing anything in practice. And Benjamin Netanyahu can shrug off any rhetoric And Labour, if Labour's not even willing to call out one single war crime that Labour has committed, that Israel has committed, and just on that, the SNP motion, which the last one, which Labour trashed by allegedly blackmailing the speaker in their own briefings, as they put it,
Yes.
is because it held Israel responsible for collective punishment. And Keir Starmer briefed friendly journalists, including his team, briefed the likes of Robert Peston, the ITV journalist, that Keir Starmer hated the inclusion of collective punishment. And that's what they were fighting. Why did they do that? Because if you believe Israel is instituting collective punishment, a war crime, Article 33 of the Geneva Convention, then that means you have to end all arms sales and you have to take action. And Labour doesn't want to take any action. That's the problem.
That's really interesting. And I'm almost the arguments that you've made today. I've probably made, and others have made to the Muslim community, probably in a less eloquent way than you have. But
I'm hit and miss.
we've certainly done that. And one of the key arguments that comes back is the argument that Labour is going to form a government, probably for two terms, maybe even longer. It may be a three-term government. The state of the Conservative Party is so poor, they're going to lurch to the right. And so, you're probably going to have a secure Labour government for 10, 15 years, most possibly. And do you really want to be on the wrong side of a future government? Do you want to be further disenfranchised? I mean, I know there was an iftar gathering, and a minority, but some members of the Muslim community decided to attend with Keir Starmer and David Lammy and others. And they were ridiculed and they were castigated for it. But their response was, well, they are going to form the next government. And do you really want to have no lines of communication with the next government, despite Gaza, which is a horrid thing to say, but despite Gaza? So I suppose the question is, we're a disenfranchised community. Governments don't talk to our leadership. We tend to be socioeconomically at the lowest levels of, the Muslim community, of the general community. Are we not just stacking up problems for ourselves if we don't find a way to engage with Labour?
No, it's the opposite problem. Politicians listen to leverage. If politicians think you'll vote for you, you will vote for them no matter what, then they will just ignore you and they will treat you as they wish.
Yeah.
That's what they think. They just think, what a bunch of suckers. They'll vote for us literally no matter what. So what's the incentive, The only reason, even on tonally, they've shifted, even though they're going to win a massive majority, is because they fear in certain seats they could be in trouble. That's the reason they've done that.
Yeah.
And I would just know what happened in the New Labour period when huge numbers of Muslim Britons did loyally vote for the Labour Party. Well, we had the Iraq War for a start, which, the vast, rivers of blood spilled in Iraq and beyond as a consequence of that criminal act.
Yeah.
As well as calamities from Afghanistan to Libya. And, admittedly, Libya was when Labour was out of office, but they backed it on, without question. Attacks on civil liberties, which were based on demonising as a whole the British Muslim population and leading to attacks on the civil liberties disproportionately of Muslim Britons. We can see in terms of the support for the likes of Prevent, in the way that has been used in ways which are stigmatising and scaring, but also, clamping down on Muslim communities in perverse ways. I've written on that myself. And so I just think, if they think you're in the bag, that's what they'll do. They'll just keep behaving in the way that they're behaving.
Yeah.
If they get to the point where they fear that there will be a political cost, then they have to go and offer you something. But there's no incentive. If they just think, well, what's the downside here? These are crude, as I've said, I think they're straightforwardly amoral people. They look at everything in terms of crude electoral calculus, and they will listen to voters on the basis of, if we don't listen to them, then we will suffer consequences electorally, and we want to stay in power. So you either use your collective voice or you don't. But if you think for 1 second that if people turn up and just, whoever they are, from whatever background, turn up to various events and just try and be nice and be, ingratiate and be cheerful and pleasant and all the rest of it, that Labour will go, do you know what? We were going to do these things, but now we're not going to do them anymore.
Yes.
It's just a fantasy. It's not how politics works, particularly when you're dealing with these sorts of people who don't work on the basis of what they think is right or wrong. So, you know, it is up to voters, irrespective of background. Do you want to be listened to? And if you do, then you have to make politicians fight for your votes.
Yes.
If you're not making politicians fight for your votes, they will treat you as they wish. And they have repeatedly treated and spoken about Muslim voters with contempt. And we can see that in terms of, you know, the polling, the research by the Labour Muslim Network in terms of Islamophobia within the Labour Party. The vast majority think there is a huge Islamophobia problem and that Keir Starmer has done nothing to do with it. Well, why does he need to do that? There's no incentive for him to do that. He's not under any pressure to do that. So, as you know, you've always got to force the powerful to listen to you, and never in history has anything been won by people just trying to be nice and make someone a cup of tea. That doesn't work.
We'll have some samosas with Keir Starmer. In 2019, opinion polls suggested that over 80% of Muslims probably voted Labour. I think that's partly because Labour has been the home for Muslims for generations, but also I think Jeremy Corbyn did have a particular sway within Muslim communities. His pro-Palestine stance and, you know, generally just his economic policies were more in line with the Muslim community. Now, I do note that you at the time did criticize Jeremy Corbyn over the anti-Semitism allegations. Some would accuse you of, and sorry if this sounds a bit hard, but some would accuse you of maybe undermining Labour in that spot where Jeremy Corbyn was probably the best candidate for Muslims from the left. I mean, how would you respond to that?
It's not my recollection, I have to say.
Yeah.
I mean, I voted for Jeremy Corbyn in both leadership elections.
Yeah.
I campaigned for him to be leader at the time. And even when there was a period when I was disillusioned before the 2017 election, it wasn't over this question. When we're talking about what is known as the anti-Semitism scandal which became dominant in the media in 2018 and 2019, which you're referring to, my record at the time was just defending Jeremy Corbyn over and over again from those allegations. So if you take so-called Wreathgate, I wrote a piece for the Guardian newspaper about, if people remember, this is, rehashed from Jeremy Corbyn visiting Tunisia, which was commemorating the victims of the Israeli bombing on Tunis when back in the 1980s.
Yes.
And what was the column I wrote? Which was, the column I wrote at the time was, the Corbyn Wreath scandal is just an exercise in hypocrisy. And I go through it. I go, which brings me to Roy over Jeremy Corbyn's trip to Tunis in 2014. Let's stick to the facts.
Yeah.
Corbyn was attending a conference as a backbencher at the invitation of Tunisian President Moncef Marzouki, blah, blah, blah. And I just go through it. I go, where he was, I just go through the details and why it was a nonsense. And I got massively condemned for that. I mean, you see, the problem, my own view, the view I had, which I stood by and I stick by now, was what I called walking and chewing gum, which was you can do two things at the same time.
Yeah.
And the formula I stuck to was to defend Jeremy Corbyn and the leadership and the vast majority of the Labour membership from accusations of anti-Semitism. And I always made it clear over and over again, including on national television, that the claim Jeremy Corbyn was anti-Semitic was without any foundation. And that is a position I not only then believed and still believe, but I will believe for the rest of my life.
But you did call for Jeremy Corbyn to stand down.
That was before 2017. You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
And that wasn't anything to do with that. That was to do with Labour lost 2 by-elections and Labour was 24 points behind.
Yes.
So my fear at the time was that, the left would lose, that Labour would lose catastrophically, and then the left would be blamed for it. So at the time, very naively, but it's the position it had, was the view that another left-wing MP should take over and deal with basically what I argue was communication issues and presentation issues.
Yeah.
That was very naive, and I would never, if I went, at the time, I've said that over and over again.
Yeah.
In terms of, my politics have shifted probably quite dramatically in lots of ways since then, partly because of, I think in terms of what, both in terms of how Labour, and I, in that 2017 election, I would know I put everything into campaigning and supporting the Labour Party. I mean, I did, column after column supporting, and, for example, I'll give you an example, because I did, you're right, before the 2017 election. So, for example, after the Manchester bombing, you know, I was on TV defending the Labour leadership's position when they made a link between Western foreign policy and the increased risk of terrorism.
Yeah.
And I would know at the time, shadow cabinet ministers didn't go on TV and did that. The reason I was asked to go on TV and do that is because they didn't want to do that. So you're right. I was disillusioned because Labour was so far behind in the polling that I feared an imminent general election would lead to an electoral wipeout of the sort we saw in 2019, and the left would be blamed, and then the left would be buried forever. And that was a very naive position. It wasn't to do with whether I thought Jeremy Corbyn was anti-Semitic. I mean, if you read the article I wrote about it, it didn't mention anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
My own view was, and I stick in terms of, you know, the position on anti-Semitism, the position I had was there were fringes within the Labour membership who were anti-Semitic, which is just true. And that, you know, there needed to be necessary action to win over Jewish people who feared anti-Semitism. But that, when I say walking, chewing gum, the position was that, you know, the position that I got demonised for, I still get demonised for it now. I get, you know, I got a huge amount of, and still do, bile over defending Jeremy Corbyn from the accusation that he in any way was anti-Semitic. You know, I remember in the 2019 general election, I went on TV just after, the day after the chief rabbi made damning comments about Jeremy Corbyn. And I said I thought it was a smear to call Jeremy Corbyn anti-Semitic. And then it was put to me that I was therefore showing contempt towards Jewish people. That was the position that was put to me. But my own view was that you had to demarcate, which was a completely unjustified attack on Jeremy Corbyn. I didn't think they always had, I mean, I think everyone agrees that now in terms of how you present, you know, how you communicate your position. Because what Labour did, for example, after 2018, when the General Secretary shifted to a General Secretary supportive of Jeremy Corbyn, is they massively improved the disciplinary process. So they had this, you know, in terms of clamping down on genuine anti-Semitism, removing them. I think the other problem is, which is often come up, which I think is a bit odd, is I did support action taken against certain individuals. But the reason I found that a bit odd is that was action taken by Jeremy Corbyn's leadership and his General Secretary, Jenny Thornberry, or supportive General Secretary at the time. I don't regret that. I don't, you know, I mean, they did take action, which I supported. Yeah. But that then is seen as, was portrayed as I support the witch hunt, which was undermining Jeremy Corbyn. But the view there is that I should have denounced the leadership for taking action against people, but I don't really understand even how it makes sense for its own terms. Yeah. So yeah, my view is, yeah, you're right. In terms of disillusionment with Jeremy Corbyn, definitely before, you're right. And, you know, and I hugely regret that. I still do. I made that clear at the time and since. Yeah. But in terms of anti-Semitism, my view is that there is a fringe on the left who definitely are engaged in anti-Semitic tropes. Yeah. And that a lot of that is bad education. It's a kind of conspiratorial mindset. And it has to be dealt with. That Jewish people should be, you know, have, you know, safety and all the rest of it. And that has to be demarcated from the abuse of anti-Semitism, for example, on questions of the assault on Palestine. I've always, my own view has always been support of Palestinian liberation. Yeah. And also the abuse of that, because anti-Semitism is real, and the false use of anti-Semitism stops people believing in anti-Semitism when we do need people to believe that anti-Semitism is actually a problem. So yeah, my view, that's my view. I mean, my view is, you know, but did I ever, you know, no one can ever point to anything that I said where I suggested, you know, as I said, anything other than that, I thought the claims about Jeremy Corbyn were anything other than based on a lie. I mean, you know, I've never believed that. I would never, ever, ever have supported Jeremy Corbyn if I thought he was remotely anti-Semitic. Sure. All the people around him, including, I would know, you know, Jewish key advisors like James Schneider, who I've known for many years, who, you know, was director of communications for a long time. The idea they would work for someone they thought was anti-Semitic is just offensive. It's just outrageous. Yeah. But, you know, that's always been my position. So I think I do see periodically, you know, those claims, but people never point to any evidence. And the evidence, except they point to, is that I supported action against certain individuals, but that action was taken by the leadership. And people, then they go, well, that was a mistake. They shouldn't have done that. I'm like, well, fine, but why are you taking it up with me? I mean...
No, thank you. I think that's very clear. Can I turn to Rochdale and by-election in Rochdale? And I don't know. I mean, I find George Galloway quite a problematic actor. I don't know. Okay, so that's
problematic. Yeah.
So how do you? Because of course he has shifted the political debate through that by-election, and you know it's brought Gaza to the fore, and Gaza has got, you know, however imperfect, has got someone who's going to who's going to advocate for the people and for the genocide, and against the genocide. So how do you navigate the idea that George Galloway is now in Parliament, but also his party is trying to put up candidates in multiple seats, many Muslim concentrated seats across the country? I mean, how do you see that as a positive or
no? Look, I understand. Look, he's filling a vacuum, and people in Rochdale, furious about a genocidal onslaught, and therefore voted on the basis of the candidate which they thought would best express that view.
Yeah.
And I could never support George Galloway, which is a huge contrast to, say, the positions that Jeremy Corbyn took. I mean, it's interesting, when George Galloway was in Parliament as a Labour MP, he refused to join the Socialist campaign group of Labour MPs, the left-wing grouping. He didn't rebel on so many issues. It's quite striking, quite notable.
Yeah.
And he was always this one-man band. But he shifted, some of the positions he's taken. In terms of, for one thing, I would say in terms of consistently standing against atrocities committed against Muslim people wherever they are.
Uyghurs or Syria.
For example, in Syria, absolutely.
Yeah.
People should loudly condemn. I didn't support any Western military intervention in Syria, and I stand by that. But no one should be under any illusion that the Assad regime has committed horrible war crimes on a massive scale, which has slaughtered huge numbers of people, not just Muslim, but obviously overwhelmingly so. And I would note the treatment by the Chinese regime of the Uyghur people. And I just think you've got to have consistency. I mean, it's different in that, the West isn't arming and backing China and Syria as they commit these war crimes. That's why it's very different with Israel.
Yes.
But I still consistently speak again. You should always consistently have moral consistency. You should always have moral consistency and speak. And he doesn't. And I've noticed. Note as well the way he talks about grooming gangs, in a way which I think is deeply problematic. The way he spoke about refugees as being men of fighting age. I mean, these are the sort of rhetoric I would associate with the hard right. Frankly, I mean, even when he there's many critiques to have of Joe Biden being complicit in the genocidal war. He started talking about, how indulging talk of the 2020 election being rigged by the Democrats. I mean, these are. I could just go on. I mean, another example. He voted Conservative in Scotland recently.
Yeah,
and he launched this unbelievable attack on Humza Yousaf, the Scottish First Minister.
Yeah.
In which he posted a picture of himself. He often likes to post random selfies of himself. And then he tweeted saying, like, you're not Scottish like me, you're not Celtic like me. Like, what the hell does that mean?
Yeah.
Like, it's unbelievably outrageous. I could go on. So I just think it's a huge problem where someone with toxic views like that is filling a vacuum, clearly. And I think we need other people who don't have that, not only those toxic beliefs, but then have toxic baggage. I mean, what that means is a lot of people, the vast majority of the population, oppose what Israel is doing to Gaza. So why would you want toxic figures who repel so much of the population because of the stances they've taken on these issues?
Yeah.
Why would you want them to be the biggest voices? He's very charismatic, George. I mean, this is the tragedy.
Yes.
I wrote a piece once about how, what a great communicator and how charismatic he is. He is undoubtedly, and it shows what minnows the politicians of today are, because they're such bad communicators. They're almost like middle managers. They're uncharismatic. They're, if you compare to politicians of the past, whatever I think of them from left to right, these were really quite impressive people, orators, intellect.
Tony Benn, Attlee,
exactly.
Churchill, even. I suppose.
Churchill, yeah. I mean, look. I mean, you could get, even if you go back to the 90s. I mean, yes. like people like Robin Cook.
Oh yes.
For example, or. William Hague was a great orator in his own way. But if you go back to the 70s, you got, people like Barbara Castle and, even again on the right of the Labour Party and then left Shirley Williams. Like you had people who were really impressive orators and impressive people who clearly had their own, kind of thoughts about the world. And these people don't. And that's why he stands out when he speaks, because there are so few people like that. But I don't want people representing. There's a problem, people like that ending up representing a cause, because I think a lot of people who agree with the horrors being unleashed then are repelled by the other stuff. People should be angry about what Assad has done to people, overwhelmingly Muslim, in Syria, without supporting Western military intervention, which I oppose. But where's the consistency?
Do you feel that's a minority opinion on the left? I mean, often when I engage with the left or members of left-leaning groups on Syria and on Uyghurs, there's a complete denial of what's happening and an acceptance that Assad is fighting the good war against anti-imperialism and that China is an anti-imperialist state. I mean, is your opinion atypical of left-wing opinion?
I really don't think so, no.
Really?
I think we're often talking there about individuals who are just relatively fringe. You know, I mean, in terms of, I don't know, left-wing Labour MPs, do any of them support that position? No, you know, including Jeremy Corbyn, who's condemned. I mean, remember when he just became leader and there was a Chinese state visit, you know, and he was condemned for wanting to take a stance on human rights in China. I mean, like, there's one example, but John McDonnell, his, you know, Shadow Chancellor, again, consistent view, whether it be on, you know, again, across the board. I don't really think there are Labour left MPs who take that position. I don't think trade unions have positions collectively which in any way are supportive of these terrible regimes. And I think of like other commentators associated with the left. I just don't think that's no. I mean, obviously you get what you're talking about. Tankies, they're called tankies in left speak, and tankies exist, but I think they're so unrepresentative. You know, my view is that you should always have more consistency, because I think the problem you get is there's a form of anti-imperialism which can lapse into, because the regime is the opponent of Western interest, and therefore in some way they're to be defended on their own merits. And I don't agree with that. I agree with opposing Western wars, which are then justified given the atrocities committed by these regimes, when obviously the West is perfectly happy with atrocities, as we can see, committed by its allies and its client states. But, you know, I'm a socialist, and the point about socialism is that you have a universalist view of the world, which is that everyone has rights which you passionately and strongly support, irrespective of who they are. And opposing Western dominance of the world and a hegemony, which was firstly colonialism with the vast crimes associated with that and the theft of the world's wealth, and in the post-colonial world, the way the world is still structured in favour of the West, and then the terrible wars committed. But, you know, you can oppose that, and you should, without somehow believing that the Assad regime is anything other than responsible for grave horrors. And, you know, I know, you know, lots of brilliant Syrian opponents of Assad have been amongst some of the most vocal supporters of the Palestinian cause. I also note as well, there's a poll just done now of Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank, and they overwhelmingly, for example, overwhelmingly oppose Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I don't think that's surprising. I think if you're a people who suffered occupation, you know, and you know, the injustice of a powerful state taking away your rights, then of course you're gonna oppose that often for the people as well.
Can I ask you about the Labour and Tory Friends of Israel? I mean, you know, we tend to hear a lot about these groupings of these, you know, within the two big parties, in particular Labour Friends of Israel. I mean, they're very opaque. It's very unclear as to what their power is, if that's the right word to use, what pressure they can apply upon the big parties. But of course, many of the key frontbenchers in both the parties are members of Friends of Israel groupings within their parties. You've written a book about the establishment, and to be very frank, there is a conspiracy theory which I think is unacceptable, but there is a conspiracy theory that sort of permeates, you know, many communities in the country, that through these sorts of groupings, Israel has a disproportionate impact upon policy, if not control policy. I mean, how do we untangle the relationship between Friends of Israel and these political groupings?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, I would just close down all Friends of ex-country groups, and I think there's, you know, I mean, like, you know, Friends of Russia, and I would, you know, myself want a thorough investigation about the links between all groups, parliamentary groups, which are friends of a certain country, and their embassies, and indeed the state in question, because clearly all states with any, you know, particularly states which have, you know, power, will try and find ways to exert that power in other countries to have more favourable foreign policies towards them. Like, I mean, that's, Saudi Arabia does that. As an example, I've written about, how the Saudi lobby, in my view, has a huge impact. But it's, Russia finds ways of doing this. So the reason I say that is because you're right. There's this, what often comes up is the kind of classic anti-Semitic conspiratorial trope of secretive, shadowy Jewish group pulling the power, pulling the strings. And obviously that was a very, important not to lapse into that.
Yes.
But equally, it can't be abused because the state of Israel, like other states, does clearly try to use its power and influence in order to shift foreign policy and keep foreign policy in a way that's favourable to it. I mean,
disproportionately, do you think? I mean,
the problem is, other countries definitely do this. Other states do this, and the problem is it's so opaque. We don't know.
Yeah.
We don't know to the extent to which different countries do it or how they succeed. I mean, obviously the US does it just because it's got total power globally, so it can basically bully people to do what it wants. Yeah. So that's like that's the obvious one. American power, I think we take it as read, is absolutely dominant. Britain does this abroad, obviously, tries to get states to follow its interests in lots of ways, including using aid, I would note. France does it. I mean, lots of countries do it, so it's not specific to Israel at all. The issue with Israel is the Israeli state is obviously committing extreme war crimes even before this, and public opinion has been very unfavourable towards the Israeli state for a long time because of that, and it's obviously catastrophically fallen. So it's obviously, the Israeli state will use any means at its disposal to try and shift that. I mean, what I just say is cut all of these, shut down all these friends of certain groups. And because I think, clearly what they're trying to do, what Conservative and Labour Friends of Israel is trying to do, in the same way other such groups linked to other countries try to do, is make those parties more sympathetic to the current incarnation of the state of Israel. That's what they're there. That's what they're there to do. Yeah. And that is a huge problem. I think if we're talking about Russia here, I think no one would even blink. You'd be like, well, obviously you don't want them to do that.
Yeah.
And it's the same here. So yeah, I'd shut those groups down. I'd shut all of them down. I'd be consistent about it. But there is clearly, I would look at Western foreign policy it's because I think there's this danger saying it's Israel calling the shots. And I think actually, when Joe Biden in the mid-'80s did this speech in Congress, in which he said if Israel didn't exist, we'd have to invent it in order to serve US interests. It's, I think it's not Israel which is somehow running the Western world. That's not true. And that would be lapsing into some anti-Semitic tropes. The US is dominant in the world. And it sees Israel as a useful vehicle to serve its interests in the Middle East. I mean, it's very straightforward. Joe Biden said it. It's not a conspiracy theorist to just quote Joe Biden back at people.
Yeah.
But equally, obviously, Israel, like other states which have terrible justified public perceptions of their states, is trying to keep those parties on their side. But I know, look, the people running the Labour Party are just ideologically committed to the state of Israel and its behaviour. They don't need to be subverted. They don't need to be brainwashed. They don't need to be bribed. They're doing this out of conviction, which is worse. Right.
And how does that conversation connect with the media, the role of the media? I mean, we're seeing what's been described as an ambient genocide taking place. It's around us, but the media tend to not talk about it in those terms, and they don't talk about what's happening in Gaza with the equality that's required to really point out what the devastating impact of the Israeli war machine. So how do you analyze how the media has been pretty horrible and pretty silent, or at least they haven't raised Gaza to the level they should have raised it? How do you analyze?
Well, it's the biggest scandal in modern Western journalism, and that's quite something, because obviously over the Iraq war they were catastrophic as well in terms of regurgitating lies fed to them by the intelligence services and the authorities, governments. In this particular case, as I've said, the Israeli state made clear from the very beginning what it was going to do. It didn't hide it. It wasn't subtle. Israeli leaders and officials made clear they were going to raise Gaza to the ground, impose collective guilt on the Palestinian population, try to drive them out of their land, and kill huge numbers of them, and starve them, and remove the essentials of life. They said all of this. And what Western media coverage should have done, if it was doing its job, is frame its coverage from the start around what Israeli leaders and officials said they were going to do, which, as it turned out, proved the perfect blueprint for what the Israeli state did. I mean, you just needed to follow that.
Yeah.
You know, that's all I did. And they didn't do that. Instead, they just framed this as self-defense against terrorism with a side debate in some media outlets about, is this proportionate or not? Yeah. Which is still going on, rather than framing this in terms of what was clearly been a genocidal onslaught based on obvious genocidal intent expressed by repeated genocidal statements, and the sheer level of firepower used in the attempt to starve an entire population, and the vast, limitless examples of innocent civilians being butchered to the extent that most killed are women and children, with about 40% being kids. So I just think, you know, why does the Western media do that? Because the Western media traditionally always follows the basic priorities of Western foreign policy. It's subservient to the interests of the foreign policy establishment. I mean, we've got a press run largely by right-wing moguls who just believe in Western hegemony as an end in itself. And then you've got the likes of the BBC, which, I mean, its employees were vetted by MI5 until the 80s, but which has, you know, always been embedded in the establishment, and which treats basically what intelligence services and ministers say about foreign policy issues as gospel. And they just repeat it. And that has led us to the catastrophe over and over again. Yeah. Because, you know, if the media had done its job, then they would have perhaps at least scrutinised in advance what was going to happen in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, and Gaza. But they didn't do that. And then instead, what you do is you end up with them afterwards going, oh, what happened? You know, as though it was a surprise. But they help pave the way. What they do is they try and manipulate consent. What they do is they help foment the idea this is an emergency where there needs to be an immediate, overwhelming response, that anyone who dissents is a stooge of the Taliban, Saddam Hussein, Gaddafi, Hamas. They do that over and over again. And then what's so outrageous is there's never accountability for the people responsible for what are clearly catastrophes. Yes. According to research by Brown University, about 4.5 million people died in the post-9/11 wars. Like, it's an unbelievable mass slaughter. And what happened is those responsible just walked from crime scene to crime scene, splattered with more blood, demanding more blood, as though nothing had happened, completely unfazed by it. The people who resigned were all the people who opposed it or were critical, whether it be ministers who resigned over the Iraq War, whether it be the BBC top brass having to resign over the 45-minute claims and the way it was reported, whilst the likes of Tony Blair ends up with a multi-million huge consultancy firm funded partly by despots and still treated as a respected statesman by the media. Yeah. That's a problem, because it allows these disasters to happen over and over again. And we need a different media, because the media is complicit in some of the worst crimes of the 21st century.
And you're supporting the organisation We Deserve Better, and you're calling for people to vote for MPs who are independent or progressive-minded, rather than generally vote for Labour candidates in areas. There are exceptions, of course. Tell us a bit more about that, and who do you propose we should be looking out for and supporting in this next general election?
Well, for me, it's very pragmatic. It's you support for a candidate based on what they support, what they advocate for. Yeah. So, you know, I would still support those Labour MPs who haven't been kicked out yet, who, for example, have opposed the genocidal war in Gaza, who do support taxing the rich to invest in our communities, particularly those worst hit by the economic dogma disasters of the last, you know, generation and more. Yeah. Who do want to take on poverty, obviously, and there are people, you know, like John McDonnell or there's a whole, I mean, where there's the Socialist Campaign Group, basically. Yes. Who, you know, Zara Sultana, classic example. Nadia Whittam, Richard Bergen, Clive Lewis. These are all MPs that I would still support if they're not kicked out by then, because some of them will be kicked out by then. I think. Well, of course they want to purge all of these people. Yes. But otherwise, my position is to vote for Green candidates. And that's what I'll be doing in Islington South. But equally, I should say I'm not a Green. I don't agree with the Green Party on lots of things. I just agree with them more than I do on the Labour Party on, you know, the climate emergency, taxing the rich, trade union rights, and opposing the horror of Gaza. But otherwise, I support independent candidates which have come out of their community. A really good example is Leanne Mohammed, standing in Ilford North, where, you get, she's a British Palestinian who is rooted in her community, and who's obviously very dynamic and charismatic and, has a huge following behind her. So for me, I'm just doing it on a case-by-case basis. So what We Deserve Better does is people donate to it, and then, already it's given, say, £5,000 to Leanne Mohammed. It's given £5,000 to Jamie Driscoll, who is in the northeast. He was a Labour mayor up in the northeast, but he's been purged, so now he's standing as an independent for the northeast mayoralty. And also Jamie Corbyn, who I hope will very soon stand as an independent.
Will he? Do you think he will?
I hope so. I would expect so. I think it's outrageous what's happened there, because what they did is, all they've done, the Labour leadership, is prevent his local Labour Party from having a say over whether he's their candidate. If they had a free vote, they would have overwhelmingly put him forward as their candidate, partly because he's a very good constituency MP. He's always, he's been there since 1983. He's been an excellent constituency MP for a start. His local members want him there, and it's a democratic outrage that Jeremy Corbyn's not allowed to stand. Yeah. So obviously people are hoping Islington North will vote for him rather than whichever hack is imposed by the Labour leadership, who will just end up representing the Labour leadership rather than Islington North.
Owen Jones, it's really been a wonderful and fascinating conversation. Thank you very much for your time today.
It's an honour. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Please remember to subscribe to our social media and YouTube channels, and head over to our website thinkingmuslim.com to sign up to my weekly newsletter. Jazakallah khair.